Okay, Phil.
Sports restarts, but keep your distance. We've got the polls, odds, and predictive models to prove it. Welcome to AAI, the podcast about analytics in sports, gaming, entertainment, and esports. AAI stands for Andrew and Ari and artificial intelligence. I'm Phil Van Horn. My good friends, data scientists Andrew Engel and Ari Kaplan are with me. Guys, say hi real quick.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
That was a quick hi, Andrew. That was really a quick hi. Well, Andrew joins us from San Diego. Ari is in Chicago, and I live within the quieted roar of the Rose Bowl here in the Pasadena area. So today we're going to be talking about European football and the influence it may well have on the rest of the sports industry. We'll get into some of the gaming, the casinos starting to trickle and reopen. We'll talk about that, and then we'll get into Major League Baseball and some of the other aspects. But Andrew, we lead off with, if only by time zone, European football is a step ahead of NASCAR and getting started this weekend. But in terms of global influence, it really dwarfs with regard to health concerns and repercussions in the sport industry overall. Let's lead off with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. A week delayed, the Bundesliga is set to kick off this Saturday, resume their season with their final 9 matches. It's still an interesting time, right? They were supposed to start this last weekend and had to postpone when several staff members of one of the Bundesliga teams tested positive for COVID-19 at the beginning of May. It's an interesting choice. I understand where they're coming from when they report a third of their teams may have to declare bankruptcy if they don't finish the season. I don't know what you do in those situations. But at the same time, their next door neighbor has canceled sports until September, right? So France isn't even going to return. And meanwhile, the other 3 of the big 5 leagues are trying to figure out what they're going to do, all looking for a way to return. England's having trouble as several of their teams are revolting just because of economic concerns of their own, looking at, is it fair to play in a completely different environment from the one that they had played the rest of the season? It's a hard question. And then you see other interesting information. Just earlier today, a number of Premier League players have really come out strongly against resuming play out of health concerns. And then there was a poll that the BBC just published. 73% of British adults surveyed said they would not see the return of football as a boost to their morale. It's a really interesting time in sports.
Well, let's take a look at that, guys. And this really leads us into the risks, right? These are the times in which we live. And Andrew, you shared with us a story, the author of which is PhD Aaron Bromwich, an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, with an expert in infectious disease. And I'll read a couple of quotes from the story. Many people are breathing some relief, and I'm not sure why. We'll get to that. As states reopen, they add fuel to the virus. And then from our perspective, guys, as states reopen, that really, what does that do to models? It reshapes them, in some instances destroys them, or maybe adds uncertainty. Ari, what would be the right way to word that?
Yeah, well, I like the word uncertainty. There's so many different uncertainties of reopening, especially around safety for the players, safety for the personnel around the environment, the third base coaches in baseball, first base coaches, broadcasters, media, and the players themselves. This is a potential, serious disease. If you don't pass away from it, it's coming out that there's lung challenges, which is especially harmful for the long-term career of athletes.
Well, I want to circle back to the story, Andrew, that you shared with us from Dr. Bromwich. one of the quotes, any environment that is enclosed with poor air circulation and high density of people spells trouble. And then guys, here's what alarms me, is we're looking at dome stadiums as being the savior for baseball, right? Possibly Arizona, Dallas, Tampa. What this is talking about, and it talks about really the challenges in meat packing plants because they're cool, there's density, and fellas, to me, that's a National Hockey League arena right there. And if the NHL execs are not hearing this and seeing this, that's a mistake. And then we'll move back to, I want to kind of tie 2 in 1 here. Ari, what you just spoke about is another story that Andrew shared with us from 538.com, and that's that most people in the States would not attend a game. And that poll's just out today, which makes me think, guys, we're really not considering the athletes at all. We're just trying to think, will there be games, will there not? What's the economic impact of financial impact on that? And that's a lot to think about. Now, guys, that leads us to our next topic, and that's the gaming industry and Indian casinos. About 500 Native American casinos completely shut down. This past week, or last week, Northern Quest Casino near Spokane opened up. An idea of what the burden financially that they're facing in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation reports that it's costing them around $35 million a month to pay their employees while closed. So, Andrew, there's a lot to bite off, a lot for us to discuss right now about what's going on in the gaming industry.
Well, I think it's even beyond what the Cherokee Nation, where they're paying their employees to stay close. We have to keep in mind in a lot of these tribal communities, the casinos were the lifeblood of the entire community, not paying the employees. Those employees may not have been tribal members, but that money is flowing back into the community, building their infrastructure, paying for their schools, paying for their health care. And without that money flowing in, there's a real question of how they even survive as communities. How do they maintain that aspect? And then on top of that, we're seeing massive health challenges in these communities, right? For the first time ever, Doctors Without Borders is deploying doctors to the United States to help the Navajo out because they have such a problem with COVID-19. So I understand exactly where the pressures are coming from these communities that without opening up, how do they pay their bills? How do they continue to support their members? How do they even continue educating or protecting them from this virus? But at the same time, I think back to Dr. Bromaj's article where he's talking about poor air circulation, high density of people. And I think about a lot of these casinos. If you think about a casino floor and how oftentimes the ceiling is relatively low, the machines are packed in, absolutely they're talking about social distancing. They're talking about shutting down machines to keep people 6 feet apart. But I just worry, what is the economic impact if even one of these casinos becomes a super spreader event? If we just have one of those mistakes, what does that do to the industry as a whole? How does it come back from that?
You know, Ari, I hear what Andrew's saying of economic impact, community-wide impact, and I think of here's baseball trying to figure out, right, prospectively, what may be the case in July, August, September, October, November. And there's a lot to consider. And that leads us into Major League Baseball, which as a former executive's right in your wheelhouse. They're planning now to try to accomplish some kind of agreement between the commissioner's office and the Players Association, Rob Manfred and Tony Clark. And we should say this for any of our listeners, because we repeat this to each other often. Until the two of them say there is an agreement, there is no agreement, regardless of how much information is leaked. But Ari, as you hear what Andrew was saying about casinos' financial impact, community impact, and then the need, What stands out to you as you look now for trying to get baseball restarted? And it's a thought leader in sports restarting.
Yeah, so many thoughts are running through my head. If we have a 5-hour podcast, I might get them all out. But financial and health and community are three of the main points. From a financial standpoint, interestingly, 40% of Major League Baseball revenue is tied to attendance. So people coming to the game, people buying concessions, paying for parking, the advertisement that people get in the ballpark, luxury suites, things of that nature. So that's a big percentage of it. And again, on the financial, Tony Clark, Manfred, are proposing a revenue split or even reducing the revenue from a reduced season. And so there are a whole bunch of questions around that. And then from, the health standpoint, just so many, concerns all around. Andrew alluded to if one casino has an outbreak, similarly, what happens if one ballpark or a handful of players have an outbreak? Again, you don't have to pass away from it. This could be, lung damage that, severely inhibits or stops a player's career. So to avoid that or minimize that, you have to go through, change of game. So almost looking at 2020 as a different season, to be unique in history. And on one hand, Major League Baseball is looking to restart in, hopefully early July. And at the same time, the Olympics, which, they've been pushed back a year, and the World Baseball Classic, which was already 2021, so not even this year, is being pushed back to 2023. So you get this dichotomy of some wanting to start now and some wanting to push back. So those are some of the things going through my mind.
Well, we're recording this podcast on a Tuesday afternoon, and on a Monday night, Sean Doolittle, the Washington Nationals closer, posted a lengthy thread just sharing his concerns about player health. When you read through that, what impacted you most?
Yeah, well, I've read Sean's tweets and, through the last year or two. And, there's two things. One is there's his arguments, and then the other is the tone. I thought the tone was, very matter of fact and professional. It was not inflammatory. So he was stating his thoughts in a very respectful perspective. And, so some of the arguments are just kind of common knowledge that you don't show necessarily symptoms, for days or potentially even 2 weeks, as far as we know, after having it. So that asymptomatic is a challenge. Having, what other countries are doing with heat sensors and daily testing, help. But again, if you're asymptomatic, you may be able to spread it beforehand. So that's one thing. And then the other is going into details, not just of lung scarring, but blood clots, strokes, liver damage, neurological malfunctions. And I never claimed to be an expert, but it's not a minuscule amount. It's a, reasonable amount to bring it up for discussion.
And yet the long-term health implications rarely are brought up in at the front of a conversation about that. Now, Ari, as a former MLB front office executive, as you look at restarting the season, it's different for 6 teams than it is from the other 24. Those 6 teams are the Toronto Blue Jays and all 5 of the teams in California: Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, the Dodgers and Angels, and San Diego. How will that impact scheduling and even considering if they're part of a pod and what that would mean in restarting the season?
Right. So the current proposal is around 82 games. reshuffling of the divisions and the matchups, and then expanding the postseason 40% from 10 teams to 14, doubling the wild cards in both leagues, increasing the number of players. The whole draft shortening to 5 rounds is one thing. Differing, like elimination of spring training is another. Minor leagues not really playing is another. So it'll be almost like you have the major league roster and then like a reserve of people that can substitute in. But from there, you mentioned Canada and other cities. Not all the games are going to be played at the regular stadiums. So it has to be worked out. Like their fans, unless they travel, which they probably won't, their cities won't reap those benefits. So that third pillar we were talking about, community, will be different. But there'd have to be a discussion of revenue sharing to be fair to cities that don't have games or reduced number of games.
I want both you guys to weigh in on this now. Andrew, we led off by talking about what's happening with European soccer. And Ari, Major League Baseball, of course, is making the headlines here. Guys, Andrew, you go first. Which one is really the thought leader here in restarting?
It's really hard because when I look at Bundesliga and I look at where Germany is in the course of its fight against COVID-19, it's very different from where we are in North America. But I think just because they're going first, we're actually going to see them forced to address some of the issues Ari was talking about. And if Major League Baseball is able to start spring training in mid-June, actually start the season in July, there are going to be lessons we can take from what's happening in Germany. And just to follow up on a couple of things that Ari said, to circle back, that impact to the player, in the second division, German Bundesliga 2, Dynamo Dresden has had their entire team placed in a 2-week quarantine after 2 of their players tested positive last Friday. This means they're going to miss their first game this Sunday. We're going to see what begins happening when that occurs. We're talking about what's going to happen in California, what's going to happen in Toronto. There's no guarantee other states are going to let their teams play in their stadium. There's a report in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that the governor listened politely as Major League Baseball explained what they'd like to do with Target Field. It's not clear that he's going to allow a team to play even if there isn't any fans in attendance. The Bundesliga is facing these same questions. They know they're going to play in empty stadiums, but they have the fear that some of their supporters are going to come and stand outside the stadium during the match to be able to show support in violation of social distancing, in violation of what's required in Germany, which makes the Bundesliga talk about, do we need to move some of these events to neutral sites? Right, we're going to begin to see all of these things Major League Baseball is going to need to face play out over the next few weeks in Germany. And then as Spain and Italy and England look to kick off, they're going to run into exactly the same questions and face the same thing. It's one thing for a Division II team to go into quarantine, but what happens if the top team or one of the top teams fighting for a championship or a Champions League place goes into quarantine? Or even worse, what happens if a team that's facing relegation goes into quarantine and ends up having to play 4 matches in a week just to get the season done? We'll find out. So I would say just by this basis of timing, European football is going to be the thought leader. And hopefully Major League Baseball is paying attention and can learn from that and make better decisions to preserve the integrity of the game, but also preserve the safety of not just the players, but the entire staff.
Ari?
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think the big challenge is to get the Tony Clark and Manfred to agree. I think they're close on every issue except the health issue. Um, revenue could be shared, but if there are no games, there's no revenue. So to me, that's like the big question. I think from logistics and every other aspect, it could it's close enough to be worked out. Just the question is health versus having a season, and what's the level of risk that's enough to give it a go ahead.
I appreciate your optimism. You're more optimistic than I am. A little bit of baseball off the field business. Seattle today tweeted out that they're announcing a 20% pay cut for all baseball ops and field staff employees who make $60,000 a year or more. That move in order to avoid layoffs. Well, a quick reminder, this is the podcast AAI. It's about analytics in sports, gaming, entertainment, and esports. I'm Phil. Andrew joins me here in Southern California, and Ari is in Chicago. We're wrapping things up here with some notes, and we take a look at the gaming industry because there are two events this weekend. NASCAR returns to Darlington, South Carolina, and returns to the track. The last race was in March 8th. Interesting, guys, NASCAR will run the big Coke 600 Memorial Sunday in Charlotte, where Monaco Formula One will not. First time in 66 years, no Monaco Grand Prix, and no IndyCar, no Indy 500, although it's been postponed to August. So it's a lot to think about there. IndyCar race this weekend, no fans. Odds are already out. Kevin Harvick and Kyle Busch are the betting favorites. And then not this weekend, but Memorial Weekend. In golf, Tiger Woods and Peyton Manning are the early line favorites over Phil Mickelson and Tom Brady in a made-for-TV golf match. That's Memorial Weekend. But guys, there's a lot to think about. The NASCAR race is on Fox TV. A lot of eyes on what's happening there this weekend because no fans, but the pit crews are limited. And there's a lot that happens in pits that are all about teams. Now, they have their helmets on. There are some aspects of a controlled environment. But to call a NASCAR race or a race at that level, Formula One or IndyCar, a controlled environment, I don't know about that, guys. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. And then, Andrew, we have to take a look at that and see what the impact is in Las Vegas and in the gaming industry, because there's legitimate, real sports, and it's attracting legitimate, real bets again.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sports betting was in such an interesting place prior to all of this as it was growing like mad, rolling out across the United States. We were poised for the biggest sports betting event of the year with March Madness about to kick off, and it all stopped. There's huge investments. We were seeing, going back to those tribal casinos, they were putting sports books into their property over the last 6 months to try to capture on this. So it actually is an interesting time with some of those casinos opening up. That means their sports books are going to open up. We're going to begin to see action on NASCAR, action on this golf event. There clearly is a desire for the sports bettors to get back into the sports betting swing of things, right? There were the reports coming out of Vegas where people were betting on tomorrow's temperature in Las Vegas because they were so desperate to find something to bet on. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much money moves. I expect it to be a pretty big weekend for those sorts of events.
Well, guys, we picked the exact right time. We've been talking about doing a podcast on analytics in sports and gaming and entertainment and esports for nearly a year. We picked the right time because here we sit, beginning of the week. Later this week, NASCAR. The next week, we have the golf event, Memorial Weekend. A little bit after that, IndyCar does rejoin in Texas on June 6th. So things are beginning. There will be news all over Europe. Andrew, you will be our football, not soccer, our football expert. There's a lot to think about. and I'm going to make one more comment. Guys, prepare your last comment as we get ready to wrap up AAI, the inaugural edition. I'll give you a second to compose your last thought here. But I want to talk about SEC football and the state of Texas taking the lead and preparing for Division I football, which, like we've talked about, has a wide variety of health concerns that are unanswered today. Yet, because it is such an economic engine, SEC and Texas football, it is clearly being approached as if it will be something in the fall regardless. The state of Texas, University of Texas, TCU, Texas Tech, Texas A&M already have said they're doing something with school and with football this fall. And the SEC is such an economic driver in those states. Today, former Washington Post columnist Dave Kindred posted how regardless of Alabama, we'll take University of Alabama, and he wrote about this on social, regardless of what they say, if they're going to play football with no fans, it's as if you guys hinted about soccer. There'll be 100,000 people outside watching on big screens and tailgating, and you can't stop that. So there's a lot to think about. And over the next 3 to 4 weeks, guys, we have a front row seat to taking a look at some of the predictive models, to take a look at some of the health models, to look at the odds as the gaming industry, which has been completely humbled, now restarts that engine, which really drives a lot in what happens in Las Vegas and Nevada. And so when we start looking at analytics, fellas, we have a front row seat for this restarting in successive weeks over the next month. So let's go to our final comments as we wrap up our first half hour. Andrew, you're up first.
Yeah, I think two things. The first is the response to the question about college football. I think it's a really interesting question, but I think very few people are asking, what does it mean if the students aren't brought back to campus? And if the students aren't coming back to campus, where living in the state of California, I could see that decision being made relatively soon. But if you don't bring the kids back to campus, can you bring the football players back to campus and have them put themselves at risk in that unknown health consideration? I don't know what we're going to see in college football. The second piece, from an analytics perspective, having built models to try to predict the outcome of these events, my models have implicitly taken home field advantage into account. What does that even mean now that these teams are going to play in empty stadiums? You know, even if it's your own locker room and you're at home without the fans cheering for you, what does that mean? It'll be an interesting time. It's a historic time, right? We get to have front row seats on an activity that people are going to be talking about hundreds of years from now.
Ari?
Great. Yeah, just hearing empty seats reminds me, I used to be the assistant to the GM of the Baltimore Orioles, and they had a memorable game they still talk about during these riots, and for the safety of the fans, clear safety, couldn't get to the stadium, had an empty field, and you could hear birds chirping. You could hear, like, the broadcasters were there. They make a comment, and sometimes the players would look up, like, why do you say that? I can hear you, there's a hotel across the street with people watching, and someone hit a home run. I think it was Trey Mancini, and cars were honking. It was one game, and it was novel at the time, so people kind of loved it. But to have a prolonged season, it'll be epically historic. And then the two other thoughts are, with the games, how ready will the players be? It takes time to, get your mechanics up, especially for pitchers, a little more for a little less for batters, but, your pitching mechanics, the human body needs to build up that workload. How will that happen? That will affect analytics as well. And in analytics, we look at what we call data drift and model drift. When the data is changed, sometimes you're still predictive, other times it's directional, others you're not predictive that much. So interested to see, how we control for this in years to come. And then my last thought, Phil, when you said double AI, just made me think of double A, which is the minor league baseball. So I have to play a word on that. But, there's professional sports, and double A represents my favorite minor league. It's like the pivotal, are you going to have a chance to make it? Or like that's generally the ceiling. Triple A, which is higher, has people on their way down as well. So double A is the best from my personal scouting and analytics perspective. But then, let's have that represent anyone who's not a professional major league player, which would be those colleges, high school, and other athletes. It's remarkable times we're living in.
Oh, Ari, thanks. And Andrew, thanks. Guys, this is an ongoing conversation. Andrew, what you brought up about Division I football, just before we went on, I believe the Cal State system in the state of California, that's San Diego State University, Fresno State, Cal State Fullerton, Long Beach State. Remember, San Diego State has a football program, and I believe the Cal State system, and I used to coach at Cal State Northridge, I was a baseball coach there. That's part of the Cal State system. I believe the trustees or the board of the Cal State system just tweeted that they will not have on-campus classes this fall. So that would really, again, we're just going to have to wait till next week to figure out what that means, because Division I football in the state of California, Stanford, Cal, SC, UCLA, they're likely not going to be able to play at home in the first month or even the second month. And then the governor of Oregon has already shut down Oregon for football in September. So guys, while our focus is always on analytics, models, and speaking the language of our profession, we're not afraid of being alert to the news and talking about the news as we share this podcast and share our views. Well, that's it for our first show, our inaugural show. Andrew, take a breath. You okay? You all right?
I'm good. Thank you.
Ari, I see a big smile. You okay?
Exhale until the next episode.
Well, I want to thank my partners, Andrew Engel and Ari Kaplan. Ari joining us from Chicago and Andrew from San Diego. I'm Phil Van Horn. This is Double AI, the podcast about analytics in sports, gaming, entertainment, and esports. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.